everyone, and welcome back to another extraordinary episode of The Lion's Den. I'm your host, Venezia Leone, and today I sat down with Brian Ecclefield, founder and CEO of Validated Claim Support. Brian has spent nearly 2 decades in the clinical testing industry and built a business that helps personal care and skincare brands scientifically validate the claims they make about their products. In this episode, we go well beyond clinical testing and dive into what it actually takes to build a resilient service business. Brian shares lessons from raising capital, building a laboratory from the ground up, navigating the realities of cash flow and runway planning, and the mistakes founders make when they don't think far enough ahead. We also discuss the differences between SBA loans and equity financing, why merchant cash advances can be really dangerous, how to think about risk as a business owner, and why sometimes the best thing you can say to a customer is no. If you're a founder, operator, or anyone looking to build a business that can survive the unexpected, I think you'll get a lot out of this conversation. Hope you enjoy. Hi, Brian. So nice to have you on the Lion's Den today.
Good afternoon. Very happy to be here.
Cool. Excited to learn more. So what I know about you is that you've raised a lot of money, you've built a clinical lab from scratch, but you've also navigated lawsuits, you've survived COVID. There's a lot going on in your story. Let's go back to the beginning and help our listeners understand, what were you trying to build early on? How did you get into the entrepreneurship space?
I've been working in the clinical testing space for 17 years now. And the first 2 companies I worked for both had a sort of common theme that I was able to learn. I think if you don't see eye to eye ethically and morally with the leadership team at a company you work for, that it's not really going to be something you're going to be able to get past. So that's what kind of helped me make the really difficult decision to go do things on my own, my way. I didn't want to waste another year just learning that I didn't trust the people I was working for or like the way that they were going about doing their business.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's A, really respectable, and B is sort of a common founder story of, hey, I was doing this thing and I didn't like how it was being done for, X, Y, or Z reason. And now I want to pivot somewhere else. So what is, maybe to intro our listeners, what is the company you ended up founding, and what did the early vision look like versus today?
Validated Claim Support is a clinical testing company. We'd be behind the scenes for skincare products, OTC stuff like sunscreens or dandruff and acne products. Basically, we're one of the unsung heroes behind some of the listeners' potential favorite skincare brands or favorite personal care brands. When somebody wants to say something about their product, it's called a claim. And in the name Validated Claim Support, we describe what we do fairly accurately. Basically, we're one of the big service providers that falls into personal care, helping brands tell their story by proving that products either work or are safe for use as intended. Some of the things that changed over time: when we first started fundraising in 2018 into 2019, I was pretty convinced that we were going to be a SPF testing leader. So sun care products left and right. COVID really put a damper on that with the whole social distancing thing and maximum number of people being allowed on sites in individual businesses for non-essential services. Even though we're in clinical testing for some drug products, we were never considered essential. And capping the capacity at like 20 or 25% did not really jive well with my business model. We need to be operating at 75% plus capacity in order to have any kind of margin. So I think that change really led to us focusing more on boutique luxury skincare and anti-aging products and some of the more complex stuff.
And that transition is just because those testing of those requires less personnel. So you were able to do that with less employees like actively working at a time?
It's a fair question. I didn't differentiate properly. It's more about the number of actual test participants that you need to have on site at any given time. So we were initially looking at doing these sort of high volume reproducible tests, but since we were limited to only having 10 people on site instead of 50 or 20 people on site instead of 100, we really couldn't do that high volume reproducible type of assay. So it's more about the participants, or the panelists, as we call them, in the consumer and clinical research studies, as opposed to the staff.
Got it. Yeah, that makes total sense. And I'm picturing this like laboratory where you're doing this. And as I understand that, building that was a part of the journey as well for you and validated claim support. So do you have any like stories or reflection on building a physical space to sort of like kick off this services business? And like, did you encounter any challenges, or, did you grow through that in any way? Did it look different than what you anticipated? Anything like that?
Definitely looks a little different now. I think building out our clinical lab was a first for me, and even really everyone else on my team. We all got into our positions by being really good at individual jobs or a handful of jobs, but architectural design for clinical research definitely wasn't one of them. And none of us had actually developed a site from scratch before. We ended up looking at like 40 different sites to lease around the tri-state area. And we needed a location that had a lot of solid sort of demographic diversity, since we need to test on all skin types and all hair types. We needed something with good public transportation access. And then we needed something sort of ground floor, lots of parking, to get a lot of people in through the door every day. The site development side, I mentioned that we were into sunscreen testing primarily. I've got 8 really customized bathtubs for water resistant testing. And I had to get that past the town zoning board, who thought they were convinced I was opening some type of like massage parlor kind of spot.
Yeah.
And it's not at all the type of work that we do, but I could totally see it when you see 8 bathtubs on the design. So that was a unique challenge for sure.
Yeah, that's it. I've never really thought about how the way you would like physically architect the space obviously dictates form equals function, right? So like, but that's so interesting from a authority perspective. Okay, so one of the other things I'm interested in is the industry that you're in is very, service heavy, compliance driven. If you extrapolate out to like clinical testing in general, there's so much that goes into what's allowed and process and all of that. So in your mind of building a service business, what actually makes a service business valuable? And maybe specifically in your, compliance driven service heavy industry?
This will probably be pretty industry agnostic overall, but conceptually, you go in trying to solve a problem whenever you're starting a business, no matter what kind of business it might be. And sometimes you get lucky because people served you high level problems on a silver platter, like my ex-bosses did for me. But you spend every day sort of trying to build your story and stick to it. And in terms of providing a service, the whole thing goes back to how you handle your customers and their inbound requests. It's all about listening and trying to figure out what people actually need, sometimes in spite of what they say or what their marketing team might think that they want. It's sort of your job on the service side to sit in the middle. In the clinical world, you're in between regulatory, marketing, and research and development, sort of sitting right at the center of that Venn diagram. So there's a lot of different interested parties who get to weigh in. And I think it's really fun and exciting being in the middle, trying to pull them all together. But that's in any industry, you're going to have multiple stakeholders, and getting them to see eye to eye is half the battle.
Yeah. And I think another part that's interesting. So I guess what I want to learn more about is like taking what you just said about how, okay, if you're successful, you can bridge these gaps. You can figure out what customers really want without them telling you. What would you comment a little bit more about like what separates a service business that scales versus one that stays stuck? So dive into a little bit more of like how that really comes to fruition day to day.
This would be a little bit more specific to my business, but I'll try and expand on it as I walk through. Basically, someone in any given day is going to come through my web portal or drop like an info at request or an email or call into the front desk. And they're going to say, I have this product and I want to say that it does X, Y, and Z. And that's putting the cart before the horse a little bit, because what you need to do first is figure out how well your product works. And then you can determine what you are actually going to say about it in the mass market. So you could go in with a plan, but I'm sure, as you know, working with founders on a continuous basis, planning only gets you so far. You have to roll with the punches. You need to have multiple different types of service categories that are going to be sort of redundancies in case things don't go the way you expect them to.
Mhm.
And when you go in with that kind of plan, that's going to lead you to like a plan B or a plan C. If you're thinking strategically like that, that's how you can sort of work the best towards a successful potential outcome. Because you can't guarantee something's going to work, but you can definitely guarantee that you'll throw a couple darts hoping that one of them's going to stick.
Yeah. And in clinical testing specifically, does that appear as, okay, we can run this test to prove that claim, but we're also going to prepare to run these 3 other ones? Is that, oh, we're going to run it with this test group of test subjects, but then we're going to have these ones on speed dial? And you know what I mean? Like, in terms of your experience, what has that actually looked like to build a scalable clinical testing services business?
Say somebody's trying to launch a moisturization product. They got this really great hydrating cream that they've been developing. They come and they want to run a clinical, and they're looking for an all-day hydration or all-day moisturization element. That way consumers can feel confident putting it on in the morning and knowing that their skin is still nourished, 8 to 12 hours later. You take something like that and you can run instrumental assays on the skin to measure surface level hydration. You can also take secondary measurements to actually assess how much evaporation is happening on the skin. So now we're not talking about hydration, but we're talking about like moisture lock, as it would be known. So you're not letting as much moisture escape over time. That means your skin is retaining more moisture.
Yeah.
Then you can measure the same thing at 8 hours and then 24 hours later. So that gives you some other potential endpoints. And then you can ask the participants how they feel. If their skin felt more nourished, felt more hydrated after 8 hours, 24 hours. So like by going with all of these different potential avenues, you might not hit all of them, but hopefully you're going to get there with at least some of the ammunition you need to put together a good marketing package.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so this is sort of a random question, but is it a lot of sort of repeatability gives you that expertise, or do you have to sort of talk to scientists on a regular basis? Like, do you employ scientists as a part of your business, or how does that part of the process work?
Something I would always want to be super clear about is I was a finance undergrad major, so I'm not a scientist. I've learned everything I know about clinical testing sort of on the fly in the trenches. I don't participate in clinical research on the day-to-day. I could, but I find that there would be an ethical issue if I was collecting data, analyzing it, and interpreting for clients. I have to have some sort of separation of duty from the work I'm performing because I could have a bias. So keeping bias out of the lab is something super critical. I work with a great clinical research team. There's dermatologists, gynecologists, clinical technicians, clinical research coordinators. Between that group, we can usually come up with a really sort of strong foundational protocol to go out and test something novel or new. We'll also do a fair amount of outside research as well. So like we'll look at what other companies have done and published. There's always that concept of standing on the shoulders of giants and building off of things that have already been completed. In this particular type of field, if it's not broken, you don't necessarily want to go out and try and fix it. But that doesn't mean that you can't get a little bit creative. So you can add in before and after photography, kind of sort of bridge some of the scientific support with novel marketing and photography analytics and techniques. That's where the creativity starts to shine. And on top of that, I mean, I'm constantly working with like legal and regulatory counselors. I do a fair amount of expert witness accounts at this point. So I get paid to provide my very unique expertise on the claim support side. Sort of find more and more that people do actually come to me to run the research, as opposed not run the clinical research, but do the homework to look at what else has been done in the past, as opposed to going to outside sources. And it's great when you get to that point where other people start to actually consider you an expert. I never thought I would get there since I didn't have a science background at the undergrad level.
Yeah. When do you feel like that changed for you? Like, do you feel like one day you were like, I'm getting more calls than I thought I ever would on this, and you sort of reflected on that?
Probably like, let's say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, once we'd already been in business now for 2 or 3 years. We started to be looked at as a different type of service provision lab, because we say no all the time when people come to us with ridiculous timelines or crazy requests that are not possible. And saying no is a way that you're going to build business for the long term instead of just getting it that one time to sort of win out a quarter or a month. It's something really important to me because my old bosses always yesed everybody. And I think once you've had the chance to tell somebody no, and then they've gone and done their work at another lab that said yes, 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 they come back to you once they see what happens when people say yes and then fall behind and can't deliver on what they promised.
Yeah. I really like the takeaway there for our listeners of like, you can be a little bit particular on the projects and the customers that you work with if it's staying true and authentic to your mission and your company, like, and the goals of the company. And you don't necessarily have to sacrifice that just to get customers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to learn a little bit about the COVID monstrosity, which affected you. So my understanding is you launched the business, 7 months later, COVID hit, and you had to let everyone go. Take us back to like what that moment was like. What were you thinking as a founder, and what sort of kept you going to build the wonderfully successful business that you have today?
We had raised enough capital to comfortably survive a 7-month runway. That's kind of the sweet spot I was told that we needed to build up in the coffers, get some sales going, and get our feet off the ground. We were open for exactly 6 months before things started to go a little bit awry, and we started to hear these musings. Like, we had a big project that was quasi pharma for a Chinese company, and they shut everything down really early because they've been quarantining previously as early as February 2020.
Yeah.
But March 12th, it's either the 12th or the 13th, 2020 is the day. It's the Monday that I actually had to furlough all of our staff. I was basically thinking that was it. There's no chance this company survives. All the money's gone. We're never going to be able to reopen. We still have to pay our rent and our insurance and everything, even though now we have no operational income. We can't recruit participants because everybody's afraid to go to the supermarket, let alone, go out and try cosmetic products. Getting paid to do it is an afterthought when you're worried about your personal safety and your health. So it was absolutely terrifying. And one of the things I'm sure you're going to ask me about as a follow-up that I can kind of lead into now is you should always, when you can, push the boundaries of what types of capital you have access to. You always need a backup plan. And I thought 7 months seemed like I was convinced I was going to be rolling in it like 4 months after we started. It would have been enough if there wasn't a pandemic, but that still doesn't mean, when capital is, and when you're writing your business plan, you're in fundraising mode, and being in fundraising mode is really different than being in managing director mode. And switching hats is the worst when you have to do it at the last minute.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So I was going to ask you about fundraising. So thank you for segueing me. So one of the things that I'm interested in is SBA loans, SBA debt, and what founders might misunderstand about that. So can you give a little intro maybe about what that means and what you've learned from your experience about what people might not understand?
SBA 7A is relatively cheap lending, no matter how you look at it. When I was raising capital in 2018, we were talking about prime plus 2%. So you were interest in the five on a 10-year term note. Very solid for anybody's business. But since the rates have gone up significantly since then, now you're looking more like an 8 to 10%, depending on what your business risk case looks like. But it's still a 10-year term, so you can borrow up to $5 million in capital, depending on what stage you're at. You do need to go in with about 1/3 of, if you're pre-revenue, you're going to need 1/3 of what you're asking to borrow, either as collateral, like equipment would count, or you're going to need investment money from yourself and from other family and friends. I don't think many banks are going to lend you SBA 7A money unless they see that you have personally committed somehow to the establishment of your company. In my case, that meant actually like putting my house on the line with the second mortgage, as well as personally investing into the company. But I ended up raising, the first go around before COVID, I did 1.25 million through SBA 7A, and I did about 450,000 friends and family and myself as the initial round of investment.
Okay. And how do you think founders should think about debt versus friends, family equity early on?
If you're pre-revenue, they're very similar because you have to write a business plan that speaks to everything from how you're going to create your product or sell your service to how you're going to get customers, to where the pain points are going to be, and physically the location, your insurance, HR, all those kinds of things are going to come into play in your initial business plan. I think 7A, if you have some sort of banking relationship in play, is a great route because it'll teach you some of the ins and outs of, let's say, commercial lending alongside of the friends and family investor private route. Friends and family is always going to be easier than going out to like venture capitalists who are looking for very particular cues and nuances. And writing an SBA 7A business plan is pretty formulaic. You just have to apply your own unique business case to it. So there's lots of resources available online. But basically, that concept of writing a 7A plan will also inherently force you to condense it down into like a 10 or 12 page deck as you go out to pitch that. So, I mean, I really suggest to anybody, no matter what style of lending or financing you might be going with, start with what the concept of a SBA 7A business plan looks like, and then make sure you also have, let's say a 10 to 15 page slide deck, and then your quick one pager and elevator pitch down.
Yeah. And now that you are past the runway phase and COVID happened, what do you think is the right amount of runway to raise? And is there like a sort of calculation that you recommend, or what are your thoughts on that?
So the lender, if you go in SBA, the bank is always going to tell you to take as little as possible. But what I would tell you is when things are good, even if you are, again, pre-revenue, just getting started, you want to be conservative with your sales numbers. I would suggest that you basically put in a pool for 6 full months operating with absolutely no income. And then you still basically take another half of that again as you're scaling into having developed clients and customers. It also depends on what your sort of time to your first sale looks like. If
Mm.
you already have revenue, you have a little bit more understanding of how you're going to scale. But, service side, again, throwing something back unique to my little niche, I would have started earlier with recruiting the participant pool so that I was ready to field some of these outside the box requests for people that had deep set fine lines, wrinkles, or combination skin types, acne, etc. So like there's things you can do before you go like full on hard launch. So if you can soft open to keep the bills down for a couple months, definitely do that. But I would push as close as you can towards a full year, regardless of what your operating costs might look like.
Yeah, I sort of feel the same way about that when people are like, "Oh, have your safety egg, be be 6 months or whatever," and I'm like, that makes me nervous. Like, I feel like 6 months is not that much time.
This
So
month happens so.
I think, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Six. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned about maybe recruiting the subjects a little bit earlier. Is there anything else you'd reflect on when it came to mistakes that you might have made raising capital sort of at that beginning time period?
I would say that when you need capital the most, it's much less available to you than when you're raising and like things are a little bit further in the distance about sales, or you're going to be scaling for a while. So like I mentioned earlier, changing hats is really tough. Once you're in the weeds of operating your company, it's tough to switch gears and go back to trying to ask for money. On top of that, you need to maximize everything you get that first go around, because every minute you spend fundraising after you've already launched is a minute you're not either producing or selling or helping your management team, with their day-to-day problems. So you need to be ready to be fully in the weeds once you're done with the initial raise. And the only way to do that is to raise as much as possible. When you start string raising debt in little chunks, my company spends anywhere from 250 to 300,000 a month now. And a lot of times, if you're opening a new line of credit, you might get 50 grand or 100 grand. At this point, I need 3 of those just to make it 4 weeks into the future. And it takes a lot of time to work with new lenders. You want to get as much done upfront as you possibly can.
Yeah, makes total sense. Something else I wanted your perspective on was something that you mentioned, MCAs. And you specifically called out, staying away from that. And so I'd love to hear again a little bit about what it is, and then what actually happens when founders choose to go down that path.
So merchant cash advance, or MCA, is a very much unregulated secondary debt market that exists, and it's sketchier than it even sounds. Hopefully that rings a couple of alarm bells. I mean, I did it a couple times, like, because I needed cash after COVID. And these secondary market lenders will basically tell you, they'll throw a hook at you saying, we have SBA products and we got these great lines of credits, but then they'll push you into this MCA thing, and they'll treat it like, if you take one of these, then you'll be eligible for better lending products in the future. What everybody really needs is an operating line of credit. Like, that's something every business should have in case you have a slow 2 months or what have you. Using a merchant cash advance, what happens is you end up paying, it's not even considered interest. There's just a fee attached to this loan. And the going rate for the fee is going to be something along the lines of 25 or 30% in today's market. They have weekly or even daily paybacks, as opposed to like just a one-time monthly interest plus principal payment. And it's terrifying because you end up in these situations where you're basically financing your own accounts receivable, and they have a claim to your future receivables. So if you miss one of these weekly or daily payments, which is not out of the question depending on how your cash flow looks, I mean, you could technically lose everything. And the way they go after you is extremely predatory. They're not like banks. They're not regulated like that. So, I mean, I would say there's a time and a place for them if you're in an emergency, but really try every other potential option first and exhaust it, because you can end up in a really dangerous death spiral on the credit side.
Yeah, that definitely is making me nervous. Just hearing about the daily payments and missing it and all of that. So I know our listeners will appreciate that warning. Okay, so to sort of wrap it up, it's been so great learning all of this from you. So I think one of the biggest messages and sort of takeaways I've gotten is that things don't always go according to plan. Um, how what are some words of advice maybe for founders to prepare for that kind of reality, that inevitable reality?
You got to consider it like you're climbing up Mount Everest, right? So like there's stuff that you don't need at the bottom that you're gonna need at the top. Everyone knows you got to pack ration packs and all that kind of stuff, but make sure you got that ice pick and that oxygen bottle ready for when things really go hectic and the storm hits up top. The concept of going in with something like a operating or revolving credit instrument that can grow with you, I would not take no for an answer if I was starting over. So I would want the fixed rate SBA 7A loan along with a revolving line that's maybe charging 1% per month or whatever it might be on your balance, but that should scale with your accounts receivable. So day one, you're going to sell $2,000 for the month. 3 years in, you could be selling $200,000 a month, and that revolving line needs to cover your expenses as they grow with you. So that's like a really great sort of safety net lifeline that I didn't have, and I would definitely not have started without if I was to go back today. That, and then anything you could do not to get a merchant cash advance, do that instead. Those are the best sort of, I guess, summarizing words of wisdom I can provide.
We're anti merchant cash advance here. So for anyone who's listening. Well, awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for your insight. And yeah, it was great having you on the Lion's Den.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. It was my pleasure.